Hello. Hello. If everybody would like to take a seat, please help yourself to snacks for the reading or wine, whatever you need. Where's my author? Oh, he's right there. Okay. All right. I'm Jane Bryan, and I'm the Director of Alumni Affairs here. And I'm only doing this because you are in the home of Alumni Affairs, which is called the Anne Cox Chambers Alumni Center, which you probably noticed. Everybody says, oh, 2 boots, but really they're in our building. I just want to get that clear. We let them go in our building. And so we're very happy to host anything for Bard, but certainly something that involves alumni. And we have a very exciting alumna here, and Robert Kelly will do the introductions. And as I say, he needs no introduction, Robert Kelly. But thank you very much, and you'll always be a Bardian, you students or alumni who've come back. So don't be strangers. We're here, and we're happy to get to know you. Okay, thanks.
After an interminable introduction, Lindsay Hill will give a very brief reading. I begin by saying that once upon a time there was a tall, slender, rather patrician student in an era when most of our students were squat and mesomorphic, and by no means patrician, but a lean patrician student who looked upon me and my antics with a certain distance, who felt rather inclined in those days, as it seemed to me, to club up with that gloomy and elegant satirist Anthony Hecht, whose tombstone covered with inscriptions is in our graveyard here. And Tony Hecht was a satirist in the Horatian sense, that is, his work was by no means excoriating, but more quietly contemplative, gloomy and very elegant. I thought, it was my impression back in those days, that Lindsay felt close to that. And I didn't really follow his career. And then recently, a few years ago, Bruce McPherson, my friend and the publisher of McPherson and Company, said he had gotten a manuscript from this guy, and what did I think of it? I had a look at it, and I was amazed and astonished by its beauty and spare elegance, its intensity, and its method. At that time, I couldn't see the whole of the method, since I saw only about maybe 30 pages. And it turns out that was Lindsay Hill, and that the book was called Sea of Hooks, copies there, which is the scariest title I had heard in a long, long time. It still keeps me up at night worrying about that, Sea of Hooks. It's a wonderful book, and I was very happy to read it now that it's published, a book that is extraordinary in its structural method. He has chosen, something that I could describe as mosaic from one point of view, or molecular. It felt more biologically, urgently molecular. The way he has assembled a great number of very small, sometimes quite small paragraphs which are like freestanding Lydia Davis-isms that are there all by themselves, complete within themselves, and yet fit together to form a hugely powerful and continuous history, discontinuously rendered, of a young man growing up with a certain kind of family in a certain kind of place, and his experiences here and abroad. That is, it sounds like any other novel, but it doesn't read like any other novel. It reads in this extraordinary way, a way that I think was brought to us maybe originally by Herman Melville in his last book after so many years of silence, when Billy Budd came out and suddenly showed the mastery of the chapter, that a chapter could be any length at all. I'm not sure that Lindsay was thinking of Melville or of Evan S. Connell's great and I guess forgotten masterpiece called Notes on a Manuscript, found in a bottle on a beach at Carmel, done in, I think, 1961 or thereabouts. or any of the things that we've in recent years been experimenting with, mostly in France, with a very small paragraph building up. I've never seen anything like it done at the size and power of a novel, and I think you will see for yourselves almost immediately how good that prose is, how carved, chiseled. And one of the reviewers speaks of it as magical, an easy word to throw around, and it's not as such about magic, but there's a lot of magic in it. Please welcome Lindsay Hill. Class of 1975.
Well, I was telling a brief story earlier that I had encountered Robert in front of the library in 1975, and I told him that my mind was open to what he was pursuing, which I'm sure was a great comfort to him. And he said, well, I'm not worried about your mind being open. I'm trying to open your ears. And I never forgot it, and it did encourage me to hear in a different way rather than to simply think. And so this book, although there's no expectation on my part that any reader would do so, is written to be read out loud. And so thank you, Robert. And thank you, Bard. This was 4 very, very happy years of my life. And 40 years later, I'm happy to be back. So the book is written in these micro chapters, and I've basically selected a series of them and put them together, some of which are subsequent in the actual book, and some of them are not, so that I could create something that was vaguely coherent. So I'll start with each of the sections has a title, and I'll read the title and then the sections. So here we go. How's the volume? Good? All right. Glass. Of the great Victorian conservatory in Golden Gate Park, known formerly as the Hall of Flowers, Christopher Westall's mother had once said, "This is a place where glass is safe." For some reason, he thought of this first on finding her body. The plastic bag fitted so snugly over her face. He held her hand a while there in the cold. It felt reef stiff. Her eyes were closed. She had somehow managed to tuck herself in quite tightly. Her face was soft, expressionless, and tired. No hint of how it had been for her to die, there on the bed in his room, the bed under which he once thought knife people slept. Plastic fingers. When Christopher was in the 2nd grade, he told a 1st grader that his parents had taken him to the country and that all his fingers had been chopped off by some farm equipment and that they had been replaced by a very special doctor with plastic ones. And if you looked really hard, you could see that his fingers were plastic, and you could see the little crisscross stitch marks at the base of each finger where they had been sewn on. The 1st grader started to cry and wouldn't stop, and told the other kids, and they told the teacher, and the teacher called Evelyn. So this created quite a stir. But nothing compared to when Christopher told his fellow 2nd graders about the secret passage that ran from the play yard to his den. Other people's dreams. When Christopher was a child, he had dreams some nights that were not his own. Dreams filled with people he didn't know, places he'd never been, and circumstances that were unfamiliar to him. Christopher called this having other people's dreams. Gone. Early one morning in late September, before the markets opened on a trading floor in downtown San Francisco, a disheveled banker, still drunk from the night before, stood slouched against his desk, staring through a wire mesh window into the shaft of a light well. He was experiencing, however hazily, the somewhat unfamiliar sensation of worrying about someone else. He was worried indeed about his friend, who had dropped from sight after the suicide of his mother, sending only an envelope with the keys to her still fully furnished house folded in a note, saying only that he'd had to go to Asia, now weeks without word, gone, no details of where, no explanation of why, not even a hint of whether he ever expected to return. Ventriloquism. When Christopher apologized to the first grader for the plastic finger story, the teacher was standing right behind him with her hand in the middle of his back. She was saying, "Christopher has something to say to you, and he is going to say it now." And Christopher said the words that the teacher had told him to say in a voice more hers than his. So it was more like ventriloquism than apology. And he knew that her lips were moving very slightly as he spoke. The first grader was anxious and shuffling, and he would not look at Christopher's face, and he would not look at his hands. The dream of the drowning child. And one night when Christopher was 8 and having other people's dreams, he dreamed that a child was being swept down a river and the child's mother was running along the bank, just keeping up and keeping eye contact with the drowning child as he was carried in the rapid currents. And the mother was running along the bank, running alongside her drowning child because she had no arms. So the book takes place in San Francisco and Bhutan. So I'm now going to jump to Thimphu, Bhutan. The dusty, rattled, and exhausted passengers climbed off the cramped state-owned bus, which had finally traversed the countless valleys and mountain passes that lay between Jigan, India, and Thimphu. Christopher, now 22, using essentially a bribe, had in San Francisco arranged to take a graduate student's place on the trip. His mother had been dead for 5 weeks when the group departed. A boy had a bird for a mother. A boy had a bird for a mother, an ice age, a smoldering fire. A boy was raised by a bird, a glacier of fire. He learned nervousness and patience and hunger, and he learned to keep her safe and to withstand the cold and to offer whatever he could find to keep her going. Edges. She didn't end up in a bus station talking to the luggage racks. She did not wander the streets talking out loud to herself. She did not believe that broadcasts from the Chrysler building controlled her thoughts. She did not believe that the luminous lines she saw around people's heads from time to time had any meaning, or the ruins she saw in their hearts, or the stress cracks in their eyes, or the inside hammerings that seemed to deafen them. She did not steal or drink too much, lie without reason, strike children, or cut herself, wash her hands too often, or blurt vulgar words. It was none of these. It was a very private, inconspicuous tear down, precise, inside the lines, with words that held their edges against the ice, but the edges could not hold. A boy woke speaking another language. Someone at school told Christopher that a boy had woken one morning speaking another language. Christopher asked his uncle Alfred if this could be true, and Alfred said that he had never heard of such a thing outside of marriage. Divot and the milk bones. Oh, Evelyn would not allow Christopher to have any pets because her philosophy was never attach yourself to anything that eats. There was a brown and white boxer named Divot who lived down the block, and Christopher liked lying on his stomach on the pavement with Divot next to him. Evelyn hoped that this would solve the pet difficulty, so she called Mrs. Maillard, the dog's owner, and asked if Christopher might give Divot a biscuit every now and then. And of course, she said. So Evelyn bought a bag of milk bones. Christopher would lie on his stomach, and Divot's jowls would rest on the pavement, and he would give a biscuit to Divot and then eat one himself. Harpsichord. Christopher had a collection of Wanda Landowska 78s that he played repeatedly on his little turntable. And he wrapped the hammers of the piano in the den with foil in an attempt to emulate the sound of the harpsichord. Theory of sound. Christopher's theory of sound was that all the sounds ever made were still here, humming lower and lower, and you could hear them somehow in a part of yourself, and the sounds hid themselves in thoughts and intuitions and suspicions and things people said to themselves that they thought were their own. So if you went into a room and you started to think of something, it was something that someone had spoken of in that room, maybe long ago. Tim Fu. For Christopher, the first breakfast was like sitting down at the meeting of a club of which he was not a member, which is to say, he was invisible and talked around. He was listening to the scholars and pilgrims comparing notes on their prior travels to India, Nepal, and Sikkim, quoting texts and delineating lineages, and he had nothing to contribute but the confession of an upset stomach, which he kept to himself. After moving the pile of eggs, chilies, and cheese around on his plate for 15 minutes, he left the table and went outside. The folly of the journey. With alarming speed, the folly of the journey descended on him full weight. What was he doing here among tattered banners, prim scholars, and pilgrims in a distant stopped-clock capital? What was he doing sitting on a stone bench in an empty square with 2 letters in his coat? There was nothing for him here. It was just the world, barren and rough, centuries whirring by, rocks stacked on rocks, words stacked on words, people preoccupied with the small, not concerns of their lives. Theory of sound. Christopher lay in the street next to the curb, with his ears pressed to the asphalt, because he wanted to listen very closely to see if there was a pool of sound, even just half an inch deep, if there were remnants of car horns and tire hums and things people had said. The boxer ambled up and lay beside him, and Mrs. Maillard called Evelyn, asking if she knew that her child was lying in the street with Divot. North Dakota. Toward the end of the school year, everyone in Mr. Kent's 5th grade class at Anglican had to write a report about a state. Christopher wanted to write about North Dakota because he wasn't convinced that North Dakota actually existed. He'd never seen a North Dakota license plate, or met anyone ever who had been there, or ever, even once, seen a picture of North Dakota in the Chronicle. Plus, what kind of name was Bismarck for a capital? Wasn't Bismarck a German general? How was it possible for an actual state capital to be named after such a person? And in the encyclopedia, the pictures didn't look like pictures of a real place. They looked like someone went out into a field and took a picture and said it was North Dakota. And the picture of the state capital was of a small skyscraper on a street somewhere. And everyone knows that state capitals have domes and are not skyscrapers, so someone had taken a picture of an office building and said it was the North Dakota Capitol. No one wanted him to write his report on North Dakota. Everyone, Mr. Kent, Evelyn, and even the somewhat feared 6th grade teacher, Mr. Warner, wanted him to write his report on New York or Florida because they didn't want him to poke around and find out that North Dakota didn't really exist. The dream of the folding yardstick. And Christopher had a dream. He dreamed that he was not allowed to walk on the floors of the flat, so he carried a folding yardstick that he extended between tables, the arms of chairs, and counters, and he walked across it like a balance beam. The ironing board door. He thought of the tall, very narrow door in the kitchen wall of the built-in pull-down ironing board that was always closed, and that had scared him so when he was small, because what kind of person could fit through a door like that? The ironing board door. Have you ever had to crop yourself to be with someone else? Have you ever tried to fit yourself into someone else's life? To fit yourself to someone so the edges were smooth and contiguous? You may have had to cut a lot of yourself away. You may have hardly known yourself when you were finished. But the other person will likely not have noticed this cost to you. Because isn't the fit so perfect? Theory of sound. And you wondered where sound really went and why it dissipated all at once instead of slowly like water evaporating from a dish. Why doesn't sound accumulate until the buildings shake? And anyway, what does it mean for sound to dissipate? When water evaporates, it goes into the clouds and condenses and falls. So why isn't there a torrent of sound from the past? And if sound doesn't rise but sinks to the ground, then after centuries, wouldn't it be miles deep? So why aren't you drowning in sound? Harpsichord. The Wanda Landowska harpsichord on the 78 was distant and muffled, echoing as if it were coming up from a great depth, as if time were a kind of ocean and the farther back you went, the deeper you were. So her notes arose from so long ago that they took a while to reach the surface, and by the time they got there, they were just a little bent from the change in pressure, because time bends things as they rise through it. The surface is thin and light, and the depths are dark and pressurized. He imagined her playing down there deep in the sea, her harpsichord resting on a seashelf, her hair floating above her head. It didn't matter that she was dead in the world where he was, because she was still sending music up. And when it broke the surface, it bent the world a little where he sat in his room, because there wasn't anything left that conformed to it. He sat in his chair and thought how, if he tried, he might follow the music down into the depths and touch her fingers as they flew across the keys. Theory of sound. Maybe sound goes where the past goes. Maybe sound goes where the dead go. Maybe the underworld is full of sound. The letters. The professor of Buddhist studies who was guiding the tour asked bluntly, "As you're not a pilgrim or a religious scholar or an anthropologist, why did you go to the trouble of coming to Bhutan?" Christopher paused, reached into the pocket of his coat, retrieved 2 letters, and, holding them out, said, "Because of these." Professor, not reaching for the letters, asked, "What are they?" "They're letters. They're why I'm here. I'm here to find out what they mean." "Where did they come from?" "From me. I sent them to myself." "You sent them? So you've come to Bhutan to find the meaning of 2 letters you sent to yourself?" "Yes." Professor, incredulous and vexed, shook his head, turned, and walked away. The man who vanished. Charles Everett Ruskin, who arrived in San Francisco in 1836, was, by the time of his death, nearly 20 years later, the largest landowner in the entire city. One morning, a dozen blocks from where Evelyn was making Christopher's high school lunch, having woken him a second time, a few minutes earlier, Ruskin's direct descendant, Jonathan Augustus Ruskin, a man with everything, great wealth, a thriving business, and a loving family, walked in his pajamas from his Pacific Heights mansion as if to fetch the morning paper, and was never heard from again. The mystery of Ruskin's disappearance was splashed across the papers for several weeks and was never solved. The man who vanished. Christopher was drawn again and again to stories of people who had vanished, people who had abandoned their lives and started new ones, men with 2 families in 2 towns, people with multiple names, people who faked their own deaths. The thoughts came back like thirst. What would it be like to walk from your life, to find its outer boundary and cross over, to stand in that sudden emptiness? If you chose new stars as constellations, if you walked down a street for the first time and invented a childhood there, if memory was a hardened over lake you walked upon but could not see into anymore, so the past was white, so the past was whatever you said it was, so you could never drown in the past. Topographical map of Nebraska. His teacher turned in utter frustration to Christopher, saying, "I have no idea what led you to believe that a topographical map of Nebraska was the weekend's assignment. I have no choice but to give you an F." It wasn't funny at the time. Topographical map of Nebraska. Standing in Laurel Super, speaking with little discretion to Evelyn, Mrs. Donnelly complained of how hard she had worked to raise Justin as a gentleman and how he was spoiled, rude, ruined, and ungrateful. Evelyn was speechless. So Christopher told Mrs. Donnelly about working all weekend on his topographical map of Nebraska and getting the assignment all wrong and getting an F. You can't walk the sun with your fingers. A strikingly lovely young woman was sitting alone at a table in Christopher's station. He's a waiter by this point. He approached and ventured, "Do you still visit your family's painting at the Legion of Honor?" Glancing whimsically out the window, she inquired, "Are you still thinking of faking your own death?" Christopher hesitated, looking down as she continued, Maybe you could do what most people do. Fake your own death by getting a career." He looked at her directly. "That stuff about faking my death was just something I told you to get your attention." Without responding, she reached into a large, loosely constructed purse, pulled out a title chart, and handed it to him. "How do you think they figure these things out?" she asked. "Does someone stand by the shore and draw lines in the sand and make entries in a notebook, or do you think it's all math?" Then, as if coming to her senses, and before Christopher had any opportunity to answer, "Oh, I'll have a cappuccino, 3 lumps of sugar on the side. What do you have that's chocolate? Oh, never mind, I'll have a panna cotta." When Christopher returned after placing the cappuccino on the table, having completely forgotten the panna cotta and not looking at her at all, he said, handing back the open title chart, "High tide's at 7:10. Would you like to go with me and watch the ocean turn?" "That's an Atlantic chart," she sniffed. "It's from my trip to the Cape." Wrong-footed and embarrassed, Christopher tried to recover, but she was already onto something else. Fishing in her purse, she asked distractedly, "Can you explain exactly how the exception proves the rule?" And before he could respond, "Where's my panna cotta?" Christopher, flustered, turned on his heels and headed for the kitchen. Meanwhile, several of his other tables were beginning to feel ignored, and one woman practically grabbed him by the sleeve as he rushed by. "May we please order?" He heard this request as if on a delay mechanism and paid no attention to it. By the time he returned with the panna cotta, the young woman had a sketch pad out and was drawing a portrait in pencil of the angry customer. "I think you've landed on her wrong side," she said mischievously, as she dashed several violent strokes on the pad and not looking up. "Well, no matter, the world is full of people like her." Christopher stood unhurriedly looking at her. "The world is not full of people like you," he said slowly. "Beauty like yours is the exception, and it proves the mundane rule of everything else." She looked up, shaking her blonde hair slightly, and for a moment became very calm. His eyes rested uninterruptedly on her face, on her eyes, blue-gray like the centers of waves, and after a long while she said, "You can't look at me that way without my having to kiss you." With barely an explanation to the manager, Christopher abandoned his post. Walking from the restaurant, she slipped her arm through his. "I'm Abigail," she said, then pointedly, "Never, ever, even once call me Abby." "I'm Christopher Westall," he said. "Where would you like to go?" "I want to take you to a secret place," she whispered. They walked to the lower Haight up Fillmore Street through an alley and into a shabby apartment house. "My family owns this awful building," she said, "and the manager lets me use this little room." At the end of a glaringly lit hallway next to a shared toilet and sink, behind a half-opened frosted glass door, was another crudely padlocked door. Pulling a key from her purse, Abigail popped the lock, pushed open the door, which scraped the slightly bowed floor, flicked on the light, and led him in. From nowhere, she said, "My father faked his own death." "He did?" "Yes, vanished without a trace, walked off in his pajamas one morning, and was never heard from again." "You mean Jonathan Ruskin? You're Jonathan Ruskin's daughter?" "Yes, I suppose you've heard the story. Everyone has." She scraped the door closed behind her and threw the inside bolt. One afternoon, Christopher told his teacher that all the sounds ever made were still here, humming lower and lower. You could still hear them somehow in a part of yourself. And the teacher asked what was the oldest sound that you could hear. And Christopher said that you could hear the beginning of the world if you knew how to listen. If you knew how to sort through the noise, you could hear the beginning of everything. Photographing hands. For his final 8th grade project at Anglican, Christopher conducted an experiment. He took photographs of the backs of the hands of the boys in his class, making a list of the order in which they were taken so that later he could match the hands with their owners. He had them developed, and then at the end of the week, he had the children put their hands behind their backs, and he laid the photos out on a big wooden table at the back of the classroom. Each photograph had a number next to it, and he asked that each boy pick the photograph by number of his hands. Some boys had arguments because they both thought one of the pairs of hands was theirs, and some hands went unclaimed. There was jostling, joking, and making fun, but not a single child asked Christopher why he was doing this experiment. In the end, he tallied how many boys had chosen their own hands, and it was none. Photographing hands. Later, the teacher asked Christopher to give a report to the class about what he had learned. The experiment caused quite a stir, so several teachers and even the headmaster came to hear Christopher explain how the experiment was conducted and how he had learned that it was not only discarded things that were overlooked, invisible, unrecognized. It was not only thrown away things that people couldn't see. It was also the things that were closest to them, the things that were even the closest parts of themselves, that they did not know these things, as if a stranger passed them on the street, as if a stranger brushed them and there was a sudden glance that produced not even a glint of recognition. That it was not only strangers being spoken of, it was things encountered every day. That this was not strangers being spoken of, this was their hands. Some of the boys were restless, but the teachers were riveted. One of the teachers questioned Christopher, trying to discredit the experiment by saying the photos were too small and indistinct. Christopher responded, with even a little anger showing through, that he thought it wouldn't have mattered how large or clear the photos were because he had learned that we live in a world where people don't know their hands, and that when someone says they know something like the back of their hand, it means they don't know it at all. The entire room was speechless. Thank you very much. So I guess I'm supposed to answer questions if anybody has one. I don't know. Am I supposed to answer questions? Is that part of this? Oh, questions, yes. Any questions? Great. Well, Robert, yes. Yes. You have a question? Someone has a question. Yes, ma'am.
I have a question about your title. Where did that come from?
So I was writing along one day. I think it was section 4,300 something. There were originally over 5,000 of these titled sections, of which about 1,000 plus made it into the book. And I wrote a section called Sea of Hooks. And it now appears as a poem frontpiece to the book. And it starts, a boy grew up beside a sea of hooks. And what I realized when I got to the end of it was that the hooks I associated with, through sort of a Buddhist lens, with desire. And that all around, people are being pulled by these hooks of desire that are grabbing them and jarring them. And the book had several previous titles, but at some point I realized that this book was about all of these desires and how this young boy navigates his way through this sea of hooks. So that's what I know about it. Yes?
I have a question about your process.
Yeah.
It's the obvious question. So can you just talk about that, pieces, and then the putting together and the discarding and keeping?
Yeah, so the interior of my mind, such as it is pretty chaotic. So, and I have bad penmanship. So I have to sort of work through those two things. So I started just writing whatever I was thinking about. And as I started doing that, these little sections, these sort of prose poem sections titled, just started popping up. And I'd read something or think about something, and I'd write another one and another one and another one. Well, another thing that Robert said, which made a huge impact on me when I was at Bard, was that sometimes it takes a long time to find the beginning of a work. And you can write for quite a while, and I think the phrase he used was, find out that you've only been clearing your throat. So I cleared my throat for 750 pages. And then I arrived at the section called Glass, which I read, the first section I read. And I wrote that just right out of the typewriter, basically. Typewriter, boy, you can tell what century I'm from. Anyway, so the book took on this kind of firestorm in my life property, where I would literally, without trying to sound overly dramatic, I would literally be driven from my bed in the middle of the night to write these sections, just over and over and more and more and more and more, and they just started piling up by the hundreds and then by the thousands. And there were many times when I really despaired that I would ever make anything coherent out of it, but it didn't dissuade me. And as I was telling Bruce at one point when we first started talking about the book, after 10 years, the sections stopped. They just stopped. Nothing more was coming. And then this, sort of like the tide coming back in, the tide became an editorial tide of self-organizing. And I had this sense of the text self-organizing around themes and around voice. And then the sections that didn't belong basically just spun out by themselves. And so that process took 3 years to organize it. And the book was basically the narrative and what parts of it to keep were basically chiseled out of that. There were 4,000 waste stone particles lying on the ground. So that was the process. Yes?
So are they forming another book?
You know, I can't even look at them. Yeah, I keep telling myself, oh, there's got to be, surely I could make a 70-page poetry book out of something there. I'd start looking at them, and I'm so immediately bored and uninterested that I just go back to writing what I feel like writing today. So it feels like going into a mausoleum and trying to breathe life into it. Yes?
So how did you know that you weren't writing another poetry book?
Oh, I didn't. I didn't know what I was writing.
You didn't set out to write a novel?
I set out to write a novel. I told everyone I'm writing a novel. Because when I was in Bhutan, I decided I'm going to write a novel. I'm going to write a novel about somebody who goes to Bhutan and learns about the Terma tradition and finds a way to put that into some kind of context that's interesting or something. But so much of what I was writing was not about the novel. It was not part of the plot. It wasn't part of the character development. It wasn't. I was thinking about something or thinking about something else. And so, but ultimately there was an enormous self-organizing force that entered the process. And at that time, I began to really edit. But before that, I didn't do any editing at all. And I'd forgotten I'd written most of the sections. Most of them I go back and read it, and I'd read it like I'd never written it because I wrote it in the middle of the night 7 years earlier. So.
Did you date everything as you were writing?
No, I didn't date anything.
So it wasn't chronological even?
Well, the manuscript was chronological. Yeah.
You didn't write it
I wrote them in succession, and I numbered them. And I numbered them because many of them had the same title. And I had to be able to differentiate them. And I knew that if I ever wanted to organize it or could organize it, I could organize it by number. So I ended up making these, what I called book maps, which were the number of the section next to the title that I was going to keep. And some of the book maps were 70 and 80 pages long. And it was funny because I was saying, Bruce said, well, maybe we could, it was a very long manuscript. I didn't send him the 3,000-page one, though. I sent him the one that was like quite a bit shorter. He said, well, it still could use a little editing. And I said, well, there's 89 pages of titles. Why don't we just take those out? So. he didn't ask that question again about the editing. So, anything else? Yes. Sometimes. You know, the thing about it was this. Over the 20 years of the book's composition, there is an autobiographical scaffolding that I started out with, but eventually Christopher became, as I'm sure there are many writers in the room, and many of you will know that moment when the character starts doing stuff you didn't expect and starts saying things you wouldn't say and starts doing stuff. And the vast majority of the book is a departure from my autobiographical scaffolding. But I did grow up in San Francisco, and I did go to Bhutan. That stuff is true. Some. The topographical map of Nebraska is true, and it was a little stinging when you all thought it was funny, but you know. But the experiment with the hands is made up whole cloth. Christopher collected small bits of paper and cigarette foil and keys and bits of broken glass, and he called these things the messengers, and he would carry them around with him until they told him what they had to say. And one of the messengers said, "You live in a world where people don't know their hands." It was the bent nail messenger. You carried it around. So I got that. That was probably section 3,148. And then, like 1,500 sections later, it's like, well, he's going to put that to the test. He's going to find out. So then this whole experiment with the hands just came out of that. So some of it's me, but no, I am not Christopher. No. Yes?
How old the book ended? How old is he when the book ended?
22.
So it's from what age?
Earliest childhood to 22. Yes?
You know that you gave all your accolades for this book, but before you started speaking, have you been surprised? I mean, just won the PEN Award. I mean, have you been surprised at this?
A total jaw drop.
Yeah.
The way the PEN Award came about was I didn't know Bruce had entered it, and sort of uncharacteristically, they informed the author, not the publisher. I had these messages from the PEN Center USA, and I looked it up on the web. I said, "Oh, this is a membership organization," you know. Then I got this email, and it was from the. So I didn't call him back. I need another membership. It's probably going to send me a little magazine. So I looked down at the letter and it said, "Awards Committee Chair." I said, well, maybe I ought to call him back. So I was completely blown away. I have been repeatedly just blown away that a book this unconventional and non-traditionally structured, it puts a lot of responsibility into the hands of the reader. And of course, in this room, I would say readers like that responsibility, but many readers don't. So yes, I've been completely blown away and eternally grateful for the attention the book has received for several reasons, not the least of which is the risk that Bruce McPherson took in accepting it. The first novel of a 60-year-old little-known poet is not necessarily the ready staple of the publishing industry these days. So the fact that choice has been vindicated, I think, to some degree is a happy one. And also the attention that it is bringing, however marginal, to the work of independent publishing houses and what they bring to the literary world. It's tremendous what they bring, and that this book can be, have some acclaim, I think brings attention to that whole very, very vibrant and important part of the book world. So I'm very grateful for that as well. I'm going to stop prattling along now. Yes?
What did you have any other job in the 20 years that you did this? Did
So I found the best use for my BA in literature and philosophy from Bard to be to go to Memphis, Tennessee and become a bond trader. So I was in the investment banking business for 20 years. I traded in iambic pentameter. And then I quit. And my wife, Nita, and I, for the last 7 years, have had a nonprofit-focused consulting business. So we work with nonprofits to hopefully make them better and more viable and more sustainable. So, yeah, I've had various work pretty much the whole time. I did take 1 year off, 2008, where I couldn't do anything else but work on editing the book. I did nothing else for that year. Well, parenting a couple of rotten kids, but aside from that. So, yeah, thank you very much. Well, you've been very generous this evening, and I'm very glad to have been here. Thank you so, so much.